At first, it didn't feel controversial. It felt exciting. Two successful people. Two confident personalities. Public support. Smiles. Appearances. Everything looked clean on the surface. But then the internet did what it always does. It slowed the footage down, rewound the clips, and started lining moments up side by side. That's when people stopped asking, are they happy? And started asking, does this timeline actually make sense? Because when a relationship unfolds in the public eye at high speed, curiosity follows. And curiosity, when mixed with unresolved history, turns into questions that don't disappear. The names at the center of this conversation are Claressa Shields, Papoose, and Remy Ma, and what fans are dissecting isn't emotion, it's timing. Online observers noticed that once Claressa Shields and Papoose became publicly visible together, the pace didn't gradually build. It accelerated. Appearances stacked quickly. Support became constant. Public alignment happened fast. And while some people saw confidence, others saw momentum moving faster than clarity. What made people pause wasn't affection. It was overlap. Because while Papoose appeared increasingly present in Claressa Shields' world, one unresolved fact remained unchanged. His marriage to Remy Ma was not legally finalized. That detail sat quietly underneath every public moment, rarely addressed directly, but never fully absent either, and when unresolved chapters exist. Acceleration invites scrutiny. Fans began revisiting timestamps, fight schedules, appearances, public interviews, social media posts, not to accuse, but to understand. And the more people looked, the more the timeline became the story. Supporters framed it as simple. Two adults moving forward. No one owes explanations, but others pointed out that when relationships move into high visibility before legal closure elsewhere, it complicates the narrative, whether anyone intends it to or not. That's where the split happened. One side viewed Claressa Shields as self-assured, independent, unapologetic. Woman at the peak of her career choosing happiness without waiting for permission. The other side questioned whether Papoose was navigating two realities at once, public progression, paired with private entanglement, and that tension is what turned interest into debate, because timelines don't exist in isolation. They exist inside context. And the context here included unresolved legal ties, career pressure, public expectations, and social media optics that moved faster than explanations. What stood out most to observers wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. Remy Ma remained largely silent, not reactive, not confrontational, just absent from the narrative while the narrative itself grew louder. And silence, when everything else is loud, invites interpretation. Some fans read it as dignity. Others read it as restraint. And a growing number saw it as proof that the situation was more complex than the surface suggested. Meanwhile, Claressa Shields continued forward publicly, appearing calm, composed, and consistent. No visible hesitation, no retreat. And for many, that confidence raised a different question. Was the future already decided? Because when public narratives move faster than private resolutions, someone is always adjusting behind the scenes. As appearances continued, so did speculation. Not about wrongdoing, but about direction. About who benefits from speed. About who carries the weight of unfinished chapters. About whether momentum was being shared equally. That's when conversations shifted from romance to structure. Observers began asking whether the relationship's visibility was growing faster than its foundation, whether emotional alignment was being publicly declared before logistical closure had time to catch up, and whether pressure, even unintentional, was shaping decisions through expectation rather than discussion. None of these questions accused anyone of manipulation, but they did highlight imbalance. Claressa Shields was operating from a position of peak momentum, financially independent, professionally dominant, globally visible. Papoose, on the other hand, was re-entering public focus while still tethered to a past chapter that hadn't officially closed. That contrast mattered, because when two people move at different speeds and different lanes, acceleration doesn't always feel mutual. Sometimes it feels directional. Fans noticed how quickly commitment language appeared online, how certainty was projected, how future-oriented narratives surfaced before closure narratives were addressed. And while that may reflect confidence, it also raised questions about pacing. As social media continued dissecting moments, one theme repeated over and over: why now? Why this pace? Why this visibility? Why this certainty while one major chapter remained unresolved? Supporters dismissed the questions as jealousy. Critics framed them as caution. And many simply watched, recognizing patterns that felt familiar in other public relationships that moved quickly under spotlight pressure. At this stage, no accusations dominated the conversation. Instead, concern did. Concern that public validation was replacing private alignment. Concern that once narratives harden publicly, reversing course becomes nearly impossible without fallout. Concern that someone might be committing to permanence before every variable is fully resolved. That's the moment this stopped feeling like gossip. It started feeling like analysis, because relationships don't just involve emotions, they involve timing, leverage, context, and consequences. And when those elements misalign, even genuine affection can become complicated. As part one closes, the central question isn't whether Claressa Shields and Papoose care about each other. It's whether speed is serving clarity or replacing it. By the time the public narrative reached its next phase, the tone had shifted. What once felt celebratory began to feel declarative. And declarations, when made publicly, create pressure that doesn't easily reverse. Observers noticed that the relationship's visibility wasn't slowing down. It was solidifying. Trips became statements. Appearances felt intentional. And each new moment reinforced a future-focused narrative that left little room for pause. That's where timing became critical. Because while the public story advanced, the legal reality underneath it remained unchanged. Papoose was still legally married to Remy Ma. Papers were not finalized. Ties were not officially severed. And for many watching closely, that unresolved detail reframed everything else. It wasn't about morality. It was about structure. When public commitment outpaces private resolution, someone absorbs the tension. And according to online observers, that tension didn't appear evenly distributed. Claressa Shields continued moving forward confidently, operating from independence and stability. Papoose, meanwhile, appeared increasingly careful, supportive, present, but navigating layered obligations that weren't being publicly addressed. That difference mattered. Because confidence and caution can coexist, but when they don't move together, imbalance forms. As the conversation grew louder, another element entered the discussion: power dynamics. Not in an accusatory sense, but in a practical one. Fans pointed out that Claressa Shields' earning power, career control, and independence created options. Options shape leverage, even unintentionally. And leverage changes relationships, not because anyone plans it, but because permanence benefits different people differently depending on timing. And once permanence is publicly implied, stepping back becomes socially expensive. That's where the word pressure surfaced more often. Not force, not control. Pressure created by expectation. Expectation that the future was already aligned. Expectation that hesitation would look like rejection. Expectation that silence would signal agreement. And expectations, when formed publicly, remove room for uncertainty. Observers revisited earlier moments through this lens. Public gestures felt less spontaneous. Support felt more structured. And generosity, once read as affection, began to look like reassurance, not proof of wrongdoing. Proof of urgency. The internet split again. Supporters defended the pace, arguing that adults don't need timelines approved by strangers. Critics warned that rushing permanence before closure often ends badly. And many stayed neutral, watching how acceleration continued without visible recalibration. Meanwhile, Remy missed silence remained. And silence, at this stage, carried weight. Because if the situation were simple, clarity would diffuse speculation. Instead, the lack of resolution allowed narratives to harden. This is where caution replaced curiosity. Because when narratives advance without resolution, consequences tend to arrive later, quietly, legally. Emotionally. Observers began asking who would bear those consequences if reality eventually collided with optics. Who would absorb the fallout if expectations weren't met? Who would carry the cost if permanence had been declared too early? The most striking shift was emotional tone. What once felt mutual began to feel directional. One side appeared certain about outcomes. The other appeared measured. And when certainty outpaces consent, imbalance forms whether anyone intends it to or not. That's not scandal. That's structure. Relationships built under public scrutiny often mistake speed for strength. But strength usually shows up as patience, the ability to wait until everything is aligned before locking futures together. As the story progressed, people stopped asking, "What's next?" They started asking, "Who can still step back?" And that question matters because choice only exists when slowing down is still an option. By this stage, the conversation wasn't about Claressa Shields or Papoose individually. It was about how public narratives can pressure private decisions, how validation can replace discussion, and how acceleration can quietly close exits before anyone notices. This is why the timeline matters, not because it proves intention, but because it reveals pacing. And pacing reveals whether decisions are being made freely or under expectation. As Part 2 closes, no verdict is offered. No accusations are made. Only a warning rooted in pattern recognition. When relationships move faster than closure, when public certainty replaces private clarity, when permanence is implied before resolution, someone eventually pays the price. And the hardest part? That price is usually paid long after the internet moves on.